Thank you very much to everyone for coming. It's a pleasure to see so many people in the middle of the Easter holiday who are still interested in these issues joining us, especially among our researchers and graduates. I'm Professor Marie-Claire Cordonier Segger, and I hold the chair in Sustainable Development Law and Policy here in Cambridge at Leslie Cavendish College. And for my sins, I'm also Senior Director of the Centre for International Sustainable Development Law that's based in McGill and hosts the Secretariat of the Climate Law and Governance Initiative, which is global. And among other pleasures, we, with a whole pantheon of judges, award every 2 years a Global Leadership Award for Climate Law and Governance, she said, looming menacingly over her keynote speaker's head. You can imagine what is going to come out in the introductions. We are very, very honored to be able to host this conversation. It's pure opportunism. Our colleague was in town for another event and kindly offered to speak to anyone interested in the architecture of the Paris Agreement, what it was like to be drafting it, how difficult it actually was to get consensus, what's happening now as the headwinds mobilize against us and the David becomes even smaller and the Goliaths multiply. And that's what this conversation is meant to be. So I'm very, very pleased to be able to welcome you here, and I will pass the chair to my co-chair, Dr. Jellie Molino.
Thank you, Marie-Claire. So welcome, everyone. So it's my honor to be co-chairing with, of course, the guru of climate law. I mean, I met Marie-Claire. I was an intern at the Environmental Law Institute in Washington, D.C. That was in 2014. So imagine. So I have been following her only to realize that I will end up here at Cambridge as completed my postdoc at USL College in private law. So I'm very much really interested in the discussion and learning, of course, from the experts, especially now that I'm also, engaged in some of the negotiations and international. Wow, learning that one of the key persons who was part of this Paris Agreement adoption and implementation is with us today. So take opportunity of this discussion, and of course, with us also are our discussants who are equally as expert in terms of climate change negotiation and other areas of the climate change. So, will I be introducing them?
Go ahead.
Okay.
We could maybe start by introducing Paul and then introduce our learned commentators right after Paul has said a few words.
Of course.
If you wish.
So actually, I try to research, and there's so many things to tell about our keynote speaker, but of course I will just be focusing on the most important aspect insofar as discussion is concerned, that he has been the heart of international action on climate change for many years. In fact, representing the French government, he helped in the delivering of the Paris Agreement in 2015. And chairing the UNFCCC Subsidiary Body for Scientific and Technological Advice in 2018 to 2019. And of course, advising the UAE, United Arab Emirates COP 2018 presidency at the Dubai conference in 2023. But of course, the most important that why he is with us tonight, this afternoon, is because of his contribution as the Chief Negotiator of France to the UNFCCC Climate Change and a member of the Steering Committee for COP 21 in 2015 as leading to the climate negotiation team and helping, of course, the Paris Agreement, which we are currently pushing for its full implementation. So without further ado, let's listen to the expert. What happened in 2015?
And is it worth trying to save?
Oh, you really want an answer to both questions? Great, how long should I take?
Yeah,
Because
could
I
be
can
a 10
adjust
years
my intervention to
until 2030.
to fit yours. Till 2030. Okay. So I hope you don't have anything planned in the meantime, and no exams because it's holiday time, if I understand.
Yeah.
Except for those who are having exams. So, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. As you said, I was passing through Cambridge, but we've talked for quite a while about organising something, so I'm delighted, finally, to take up that invitation and have an exchange with a number of you around the multilateral climate process, how we got here, where we are, and where we're going. Now then, if I'm going to be useful, I will keep my comments short, which means I won't actually say anything very much. But first, something on where we came from. And at the end of last year, we had the 10 years of COP21 and the adoption of the Paris Agreement. And on the 12th of December last year, I seemed to be running around Paris, running into Laurent Fabius in different meetings as we walked from one meeting to another across the Seine, talking each in turn along with others about what happened before we ended up having a nice drink in the evening. So, I mean, the main thing about it is we could say it's done 10 years ago. But getting that agreement was far from straightforward. We had a relatively good configuration of interest. We had, for example, a US government which actually accepted the existence of climate change. Sorry, I'll be silent for a moment. Which actually accepted the existence of climate change. We had a relationship between China and the US which was not easy, but which was based on an ongoing dialogue between them rather than simple confrontation. And I spent a lot of time, or with a French team, we spent a great deal of time talking to both of them, in particular getting reports from each of them and what they'd said to the other. Quite often it wasn't the same report we got back, but it was extremely interesting to see where they varied. But also as a team, I mean, I led a negotiating team with around about 20 odd colleagues from the Ministry of Ecology, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the French Treasury, the French Agriculture Ministry, and a few other organizations that contributed. And we had time, thankfully, we had more than a year to prepare that team, to get to know all the topics, but also to get to know all the people. And running a multilateral negotiation, it's about the badge in front of you, the panel that says, I'm speaking on behalf of France, I'm speaking on behalf of the African group of negotiators, I'm speaking on behalf of China, whatever. But it's also people that you're working with all the time. And building up those personal relations with our colleagues was a very, very important part of the year running up to December 2015. That I knew my colleagues, that the experts in my team knew the people working on mitigation or adaptation to climate change or finance, and had that really quite fine expertise. Wait for the door to close. Power-assisted doors are great. That really fine knowledge of who people were, where their positions were, but also the ability just to send them a quick message saying, we want to understand you. Going behind positions was a key part of our work in preparing the Paris Agreement. I'm not going to go into the mechanics of it, I'm not going to go into the detail of all the positions, but just to say that human side, that working with people, was a vital part of our preparation. And we did that at many different levels. Laurent Fabius, who was chairing the COP, who brought a sort of a power when he came into a room. It helped that he was surrounded by 4 bodyguards most of the time as foreign minister, but he brought a sense of power when he came into the room, which most people in a multilateral negotiation coming from environment ministers and other, they don't have that sense of power. Fabius has it. I saw him a few days ago. He's getting a bit older, he doesn't have bodyguards around him anymore. He still has that sense of seniority and importance. That helped. But we made it sure that he talked to the negotiators. He knew the people from the key groups. He knew people. He wasn't only talking to their ministers or even their heads of state and government. He knew the people he had to understand. And he was open. He had an open door throughout the conference to talk to everyone, to know their concerns. He didn't always answer them. He quite often spent his time listening and building up a political capital to say, I understand you, without necessarily trying to negotiate with people. It's not the role of a chair to negotiate with everyone, because if you do that, then you have to find a deal with everyone. You want them to find a deal between themselves, but you're there to facilitate it. And Fabius played that I think, excellently, and the rest of us did the best we could in supporting him, along with Laurence Tubiana, who was our special envoy and ambassador, who spent a large part of her time on that. We also mobilized massively the whole of the French diplomatic network. It obviously helped that Laurent Fabius was foreign minister, because ambassadors listened to him when he told him that he wanted something. Otherwise they get moved to another post. And none of them wanted to be moved to certain places, so they wanted to keep their nice post in a capital. They really liked their residence and their chauffeured car and the rest of it, so they wanted to keep that. And so they finally started. It was a cultural change, because 10 years previously I remember going to places were holding COPs, and if we could get the ambassador in the country interested in the fact we'd made progress. Some of them understood it, most of them couldn't care less about the climate issue in those days. That changed in 2015, and using the diplomatic network also meant we had a huge level of information coming in. I had a negotiating team, a colleague of mine led a diplomatic team. We also had a team focused on action initiatives, the partnerships around different challenges. But we mingled the teams. So I had people in my team who were working, say, on forestry issues, but they were also keeping a very close eye on all the issues of, say, Central Africa or Indonesia, countries with very strong forest interests. Likewise, the colleagues who are working on adaptation and loss and damage were particularly focused on the island states. And so we tried to have a sort of matrix of our team, working on the substance, working on some of the initiatives, but also understanding, once again, what countries were looking for. What countries say in a room when they come in. Yes, you need to know what's in their statements, what's in their submissions, but also talking to them, looking behind the scenes. The diplomats who provide reports on, well, yes, that's the position, but here's the internal debate going on in the country. This is what's being said in the parliament. This is where the business community is coming from. The mayor of the major city, who's part of the opposition, is also saying this. That sort of background was very, very rich in helping us. So building on that was vital. Of course, we had to work on the substance. One of the lessons we drew from Copenhagen, and I'll finish on the history and come very quickly to where we are. One of the lessons we drew from Copenhagen in 2009 is parties went into there, and I was one of the European Union's negotiators in Copenhagen for my responsibilities, is we went into that without having a sufficient common understanding of where a deal might actually be found. We sort of knew vaguely we'd all have to move, but we hadn't done the preparatory work. So we brought lead negotiators and then ministers together several times throughout 2015, and we tried to bring them into small rooms around a table of this sort of size. You take people in, we had 60 or so countries coming to these meetings, so we had a big meeting room, but we broke it out into small meetings. So you'd actually have to listen to the person on the other side of the room. You couldn't just sit there and read your notes and then go shopping and wander off. I'm being a bit cynical, but you couldn't focus on the other things. You actually had to be part of the meeting and listen, and then you actually start to get some exchanges between people in the room. They didn't solve the underlying issues, but we understood that after that, people were starting to say, well, I'm going to have to make a deal with them. We're going to have to find this common understanding. And those bilateral conversations were continuing. So we did everything we could to encourage them. And managing a negotiation process to the end. At the end, you're in text. At the end, you're into the where is the deal. You're trying to find that sweet point where everybody is going to accept the deal. Nobody is going to slam the door shut. Not even a power-assisted door shut, to say we're not part of it. And that's where we managed to get at the end of Paris. Nobody was totally happy. I always put it to the French team as a press notice test. You want think about what every minister in the room, or even head of state or government, is going to say when they go back to their domestic press, to their domestic audience. Why did I accept this deal? I got this and this and this. Of course, I'm really disappointed I didn't get a clearer statement on this. And I made concessions on these areas. We showed lots of flexibility. But in the end, these things made it work. The ambition, the need to tackle climate change, having everybody on board, the rolling nature to build up ambition over time, to mobilize finance and to align it with our climate action, to give equal importance, not just to mitigation, but to adaptation. different people found different things in the deal, but putting that together was what we had to deliver. We had a chance of having a very, very good secretariat to help us at the time. I think unfortunately the secretariat's a bit weaker since then, but we had a very, very good team, and I have to underline that. We had a very good French team. I'm very proud of the team and what work they did, but we also had some very, very good partners we worked with who helped advise us and particularly help us find the right language at the very end. So getting that deal, and in the end there were some countries we just had to bring on board. India was giving up quite a lot in accepting a deal where everybody was on the same level. On the other hand, we had initiatives alongside, things like the International Solar Alliance, which was put forward, other initiatives of that sort. It wasn't only the multilateral text, it was the action initiatives and the overall diplomatic package that we put together that was also part of this, the collaboration around a deal. A country like Turkey wanted some recognition for its special circumstances. We put that off. It caused problems later on, but
See you in Antalya.
We're going to Antalya in a few months' time, and maybe we will finally sort out the position of Turkey. We had Nicaragua, which was very, very unhappy with the deal which was reached. But we made sure that they were not going to oppose the consensus. They didn't join the consensus, but they didn't oppose it. And there's a huge difference in a multilateral setting between supporting and opposing. In fact, in Nicaragua asked for the floor as Laurent Fabius was gaveling the deal. Well, we had 10 minutes of standing ovation, we then heard a few speeches, then Nicaragua was given the floor. It's a bit deliberate sort of stage management in a way. If you have the speech for the comment first, you then get lots of people coming in to do it. We wanted to get it over with. It was 7:30 on Saturday, we'd already run over by 24 hours, but everybody got their say. And a year later, when Trump came in and the US left the Paris Agreement for the first time, Nicaragua joined. So the politics changed. So just in terms of management, I'll leave the Paris Agreement to that, but I'm very happy to talk in more detail. Where we are and where we go, and I'll be very short because everybody else needs to talk. I think we are in a situation, we have all the rules for Paris in place. It took a while, but they're complex, putting those rules in place. Some of them, such as the rules for Article 6 on carbon markets, were particularly technically difficult to get right. It would have been nice to get them sooner, but they're in place.
Cheers, Harrow, one of the top experts in the world on Article 6 right next to you. I think he would have liked to get them sooner too.
Yeah, well, I'd have liked them sooner too, because I was chair of SBSTA for a couple of the subsidiary body which had responsibility for negotiating them, and I was frustrated for several years by not delivering on that, but never mind. There were things which we wanted to get sooner, but they're in place. And the thing is, after a while, if you keep on negotiating further, you reopen things. We need to make this system work today, and I think that's the most important thing I draw from where we are. It's making the system deliver. I think we can have polemics about is everybody doing everything they should. There are some NDCs that are missing. I think it's great that we get them as soon as possible, but I think we can leave the Paris Committee on implementation and compliance to say whether countries are in compliance or not with all their commitments. But I think the most important thing now is to work with countries on the development and the implementation of their policies and taking that forward rather than finger pointing. It's building common ground, and in particular the international context is obviously toxic. We have wars around the world. We have a US administration which has left the Paris Agreement, which says it's not implementing the convention either, and which is kidnapping foreign leaders, launching wars, and treating trade as if it's a matter of personal whim rather than something which has any element of rules-based logic to it. It makes it very, very hard to imagine where a rules-based international system goes, and we can't be naive in working on this. We have to think about power relationships and alliances. We have obviously war in Ukraine, we have geopolitical tensions elsewhere, and we also have a sense in many countries, particularly in the north, the world is changing so much that we're losing our sense of our place in the world. I think that's actually a really good thing. 200 years of dominance by the North is ending. We're rebalancing the world in a good way. But it's a difficult situation, it's a difficult rebalance to manage. And I think that remanaging and the transition is also underpinning many of the tensions we're feeling around the world. So those make it extremely difficult. And I think in terms of where we go next, the key thing now is, for me, the implementation. It's strengthening implementation, moving away. We still have things to negotiate in the years to come. There will always be things at the COP to negotiate. But the lesson I draw from the last COP in Belém is that it's not whether we reach agreement on a roadmap in a decision that matters. It's whether we can collaborate on the initiatives and the actions that start to really unpin the blockages to action that countries are encountering. Whether that's finance, how to manage a transition, the multiple dimensions of those challenges. I won't go into details here because it's not the aim. And I think what the Brazilian presidency did in Belém was extremely important. It worked on the action agenda. That's the part we launched in Paris in parallel to the Paris Agreement. And for a number of years, it became a space that multiplied in size. When I was an advisor to the UAE, I often had people coming up to me in the team saying, "Oh, we've decided to launch a new initiative on such a topic. Can we sit down with you and talk it through?" And I said, "Well, of course you can. And it's great to do something on nature. It's great to do something on cities. It's great to do something on yet another topic. We need all of these. But how's this building on what's been done before? How is it going to be followed up?" And I think we had a number of years of the multiplication of initiatives, many of which, like this one, you have a photo. You have the COP president in the middle with a couple of leaders, ministers, maybe a head of state of government, CEOs, a film star if you can. It works really well on social media. And you put that about. And the long life of the initiative is sometimes about the same as the photo on social media. There was a study done a year ago of initiatives done in Baku. Are they quantified? Yes. Is there a secretariat to follow them up? No. Is there a timeline to follow these up? No. So you end up with this set of vanity initiatives building up, and they're great. You get lots of coverage in the press. It sounds wonderful when you launch them. They're not actually delivering. Now, some of them are, and I think there are many initiatives out there which are really valuable. I don't want to criticize everything, but there's a lot in there. There are several hundred of these now that are built up that are not delivering. And I think Brazil started to try to put some order into that, structuring them around 6 main axes, and starting to think about implementation plans for them. I think you can criticize what was done. It's not enough. It needs to be taken forward. So what we need as we go forward is to really deliver the formal piece of the Paris Agreement. The NDCs need to come in. We need to make sure the transparency system is working. I'm worried about the countries that haven't submitted transparency reports. That needs to be resolved and find out why. There can be good reasons. It's not easy to move into these systems. It's not easy to put in place all the information gathering and analysis. Let's talk about the challenges. But that needs to work. The NDCs need to be there. They're not pieces of paper that say, here's a target. It's a set of policies. It's a set of national legislation that's there. It's investment plans that involve the actors at different levels, including different levels of subnational government and of course the private sector in implementation. So you need all of these for the process to deliver. I think those pieces are coming together. There's a lot we need to do to strengthen it and to accelerate it in the next few years. So we've got a really horrible context. COPs in the coming years are going to be dominated by who's turning up, who's not sending a delegation. Are people tempted to leave? Are they not delivering? But I think those of us who really want to see it work, and I think we've got a system that can work. It's not perfect, but it's what we've got, and we need to make it work because this challenge is not going away. We've had 3 years when the average temperature has been touching 1.5 degrees. We're going beyond that. The impacts are building up. The consequences for food security, for the livelihoods of billions of people are at stake. So we need to make this work. I'll stop there, and I'm very happy to come back. And my apologies for taking too long, being
Not
far
really.
too rambling.
No, it's absolutely fine, and this is meant to be a conversation, not a
So I meant to
formal
stop
presentation.
and
So
okay.
deeply
Point taken.
appreciated.
Point taken.
I'm going to turn to my co-chair to introduce an extremely distinguished and insightful set of kind commentators who have agreed to join us and contribute their reflections on Paul's words. And then what we want to do, of course, is open up to all of you comments as well as questions. We'd like to hear your ideas, and then also, of course, since you do have direct access to somebody who's sort of one of the main architects of the Paris Agreement, feel free to ask a few clarification questions. A COP and a treaty process, whether you're pro bono assisting the Highly Climate Vulnerable Countries Forum, which at that time was a lot lower number of self-identified countries than we are today, or whether you're serving the presidency in an expert capacity, or whether you're the head of DEL for an international development law organization with your own mandate and set of priorities. The COP is a little bit like that old story about the elephant where you sort of touch the trunk and it feels like a rope, and someone else touches the side and it feels like a wall, and somebody else touches the leg and it feels like a pillar. So you'll have 1,000 perspectives out of 10,000 people who were there on what it actually looked like and what the Paris Agreement is focused on. And that's normal. You have a unique opportunity to sort of speak with somebody who probably understands about 950 of those 1,000 perspectives. Definitely please take advantage. I'm going to turn to Jellie to introduce our learned commentators.
So we have four distinguished commentators here. On my right is, of course, Professor Marcus Gehring, the professor on European and International Law, and also a law fellow at the Hughes Hall College and the director of studies. And also, the far right is Professor Haro.
Far left.
Far left, sorry, Professor Haro.
The Labour councillor was suddenly looking horrified.
Yes, Professor Haro, Professor of Climate Law at the University of Cambridge, also a law fellow at the Hughes Hall, where I'm also from. And he is the editor-in-chief of the Review of European Comparative and International Environmental Law, which is one of the top-tier peer-reviewed environmental journal. And of course, the top right is Dr. Antoinette Nestor, the Senior Teaching Associate in Law at the Department of Land Economy here at the University of Cambridge. She is also Director of Studies at the Land Economy. And of course, she's a member of the Cambridge City Council and the Cabinet Member for Culture and Economy and Skills, also here. And of course, another discussant that we have is Advocate Dehas Raj Rao, which is a PhD candidate here at the University of Cambridge, and he is a senior manager of the Center of International and Sustainable Development Law. So we'll begin with Professor Haro. Professor Marcus, as I introduced them.
Yes, thank you very much. Maybe I can start. I think Paul highlighted how much effort the French government put into the COP, and I think it's fair to say that we've not seen an equal level of engagement from subsequent presidencies, which is perhaps a problem. Having drafted the Constitution of Climate Change is, of course, the sort of mothers and fathers of that constitution are always a fantastic source to ask going forward in these times of unprecedented challenges and unprecedented levels of blatant and manifest breaches of international law. There's a real sort of question: who will stand up for an agreement like the Paris Agreement? I'm looking at the European Union, which I study very carefully, and I'm slightly worried because levels of ambition in the light of these overt actions by the US government levels of ambition have clearly dropped, and public perception seems to be changing, which is kind of strange because the science is becoming clearer by the day, and the problem is not going to go away. So my question is, I think you highlighted these different initiatives, the area that I work in, trade, EU and international trade, and I'm on my way to Yaoundé. There is a forum of trade ministers interested in climate change. There is a forum starting to discuss trade and the sort of pathway to trade and climate change more intensively, also because of the COP decisions and agreements reached in Belém, but it's completely divorced from the main discussions in the WTO forum. And yes, maybe they have more existential questions to answer, but we're not making enough progress on sort of integrating different areas, different voices, maybe even, as is the promise of sustainable development, and that worries me. And I was wondering whether you're worried about that too.
Thank you. I'll turn to Harrow as well. Speaking of Article 6 as a key element.
I'm not going to say anything about Article 6, so I'm just going to disappoint you right there. What I am going to do is maybe just go back 10 years ago to note where I was and how, the first answer is I wasn't in Paris. Well, I was in Paris, but only if everyone would have finished on time, which I would have been right there, but as Paul already mentioned, and as is very usual, of course, things went on later and later, and I had to go to the other side of the world for a conference. But I remember being very jet-lagged and very emotional as well to see, ultimately, indeed, Laurent Fabius gaveling through the agreement. And for me, I think it is a momentous or like a historic moment still, and will remain a historic moment in the development of international environmental law. But at the same time, what we've seen, particularly in the last year, given that it was 10 years ago since the Paris Agreement was adopted, we see quite a bit of reflection. And some of those reflection has pointed to obvious problems, right? Like problems that we know about, right? Like issues related to the consensus requirement in international negotiations, issues that the NDCs overall do not end up, the NDCs not being submitted on time, like the problems that Paul already referred to. But I think what is missing is a fairer reflection on what Paris was expected to achieve in the first place. And I think it's about 15 years ago now that I wrote a policy brief titled Great Expectations. And I think one of the things that my colleague and I in that brief argued is that too many expectations are loaded upon on the international negotiations to solve the problem. And basically we argue, first of all, these expectations are unfair because of the realities of how international negotiations work and how international environmental agreements are negotiated and implemented. But second of all, if we're just focusing on that one moment every year and whether the COP will save the climate or not, and to be very clear, a lot of people inside these processes are also guilty of like hyping up a COP decision every year. As much as I love to follow the COPs, as much as I love to analyze COP decisions, no, the end of the world will not be signified whether fossil fuels are included, yes or no. Right? Like, so it's important for all kinds of reasons, but it's not make or break for the climate as such. And I think this is maybe the first realization that we need to have, and we need to keep in the back of our minds when we're talking about Paris Plus 10. Which brings us to the real issue, which Paul already highlighted, which is implementation. Right? Like, so ultimately, everything hinges on basically what not just states, but also non-state actors are doing on the ground. And the real question is, what role does the international process have? And it's going to be automatically, or by definition, limited role in actually facilitating that implementation. And Paul already gave you an example, right? Like by putting in place follow-up processes to make sure that these cooperative initiatives that are being launched left, right, and center are not just paper tigers, right? Like, so basically, putting in place accountability processes using the UN label where it's appropriate to make sure that these initiatives and that these actors involved in them actually earn it as well. So that's to me one aspect of implementation where the UNFCCC process has a role to play. I think the UNFCCC process also will remain important, as Paul already mentioned, when it comes to simply monitoring and tracking what countries are doing, right? Like, so what states are doing through the biannual transparency reports under the Paris Agreement. So again, it's not rule setting or negotiating new rules, but simply by monitoring what countries have already agreed upon in Paris. I think the third one, which is a bit more difficult to implement, but it's important to think about, is the signaling role that these conferences can have. Right, like, so every year you have pretty much all countries in the world, except for one now, coming together and basically trying to think about, well, what are the signals that we want to give, not just, let's say, our domestic constituencies, also investors, companies, all kinds of stakeholders in where the world needs to go. This is where I think, for example, the global stocktake a few years ago played an important role, and in my view will again play an important role in the next few years. Right? We see here, hidden in the COP decision, the signal of transitioning away from fossil fuels, the signal of tripling renewable energy by 2030, and these are important signals that can be taken up by a variety of stakeholders. Having said that, I do think one of the challenges that I see with the international process, and it goes back to the point that I was making earlier about great expectations, is one of combination of lethargy and apathy. Like, if we, like, so, and I think media has a very, very important role to play here as well, right? Again, if it's all about big bang decisions, will they, won't they include particular form of text in a final COP decision that again will make or break the climate? As long as that's going to be the messaging coming out of COPs, and as long as that's what the main thing is that, let's say, the general public get from these conferences, I think people will completely lose interest and also lose buy-in into the international negotiation process. And I do think that is a significant risk that we need to address over time. Scaling down, potentially an option, and I'm sure Paul has some thoughts about this as well. Separating some of the more political aspects from the let's say the nitty-gritty negotiations is another option that has been put forward in the literature. So there's a number of ways in which we can do this, but I do think we need to confront this risk. The final point that I wanted to make is also related to implementation and how to move forward, and it goes back to the roadmaps that Paul referred to. So one of the roadmaps which parties could not agree on in a COP decision, but ultimately the Brazilian presidency decided to take forward, is a fossil fuel roadmap. Now, the Brazilian presidency is working on that, inviting people to share their views. At the same time, what is happening a month from now is a completely separate conference in Colombia, where countries are talking about transitioning away from fossil fuels. No, the United States will not be there. Very unlikely that anyone from the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia will be there. But a number of governments from across the world will be there to talk about transitioning away from fossil fuels, which arguably one should see as one of the key steps to take to address climate change. And why I want to relate this back to the UNFCCC is that it's going to be an interesting thing to follow and monitor to see to what extent this can provide a model to how to take things somewhat outside of the UNFCCC, not completely cutting ties, but at least somewhat outside of the UNFCCC, working with a coalition of countries that is eager to move forward on a particular issue where they know for a fact they cannot make that progress through intergovernmental negotiations. So I think there's actually quite a lot at stake in Santa Marta next month, beyond, let's say, just having a conference of focusing on fossil fuels. For me, it is also about, can this model work where we have groups of countries coming together to move forward outside of the UNFCCC process, but not completely cutting ties with that process altogether. And then just to throw a question at you as well, completely unrelated to what I was just talking about, but simply because I have the opportunity now. So, and the students that will know about this. So a few months ago, two people who I think you know reasonably well, so Sue Benias and Dan Bodansky, wrote a blog in which they argue that the ICJ's advisory opinion from last year is going to make life difficult for negotiators in the future. Because suddenly COP decisions might give rise, or at least be used in the interpretation of the Paris Agreement, and therefore give rise ultimately to legally binding obligations. But also here we have an international court overruling what negotiators in Paris agreed. Right? I'm just trying to roughly depict what they're saying. And my question is, do you perceive something like that as well from the perspective of negotiators?
Excellent. And what a great question to ask in a law faculty. All right, and then Antoinette, I understand you just have a couple of things you wanted to add,
Yeah.
and I'm hoping you can also bring a little bit the standing on the ground local perspective.
Thank you. What Paul offered basically is that this timely reminder that the real test of climate ambition lies not really in the drama of the international negotiation that you described, but more this quieter, demanding work of domestic implementation. And it's basically this willingness of institutions to make decisions under uncertainty, to resist political short-termism, and to ground action in evidence rather than rhetoric. Now, the architecture basically of depends on this national and local system capable of translating broad commitments into what legally coherent, administratively workable action. And this is where climate governance becomes inseparable from public law. And you have this implementation gap between what is promised internationally and what is delivered domestically. So it's not really just this policy challenge that we see, it is an evidential and legal one. And if I may, I have one very small case, perhaps you've heard about the third runway at Heathrow Airport. And of course, the Court of Appeal, they held that the Paris Agreement was a relevant consideration in relation to domestic decision making when it comes to airports. But even though the Supreme Court overturned that decision later on, this case nonetheless illustrates this contested and evolving role of international climate norms within the domestic administrative law. So when we take together a series of cases, and I can tell you the cases later on when we have more time, they basically reinforce how essential evidential standards are to be basically the integrity of climate governance. So we don't have, for example, clear indicators for transparent reasoning and reviewable justification. All this adaptation risk that we want to see, they just become aspirational rather than actionable. So just to wrap up, basically, these international climate commitments that we see, they only acquire meaning through the domestic legal and administrative systems that must interpret or personalize and implement them. So the future of this climate governance that we see year on, will turn on to our ability to design those institutions that are capable of evidencing those choices and justifying the trade-off, and also withstanding scrutiny. And what I take, from today as well is this sort of appreciation for the role of law and the legal reasoning in shaping all those climate outcomes, and they take integrity of our climate commitments and what they rest, and what it is basically the strength of the system that implement and review them. So that's my two pieces of
I wish I'd had you in Canada when we were trying to reestablish our Ministry of Environment and Climate Change after Harper. That was Canada's kind of first attempt at Trump. It didn't go well for us because those were very much the messages that we were also trying to discuss with our provinces, each of which had most of the jurisdiction. And I think we completely understand and certainly deeply value not just what you're saying, but also frankly what you're doing on the ground. Antoinette is also one of the hosts of the Climate Action Weeks here in Cambridge and the festivals and other activities that are going on locally. So shout out to you for that. I'm going to turn, last but not least, to someone who has studied deeply the compliance mechanisms of not just the Paris Agreement, but others as well, and the research coordinator of our Democratizing Education program, Advocate Tejas Rao.
Thank you very much, Milka, and thank you, Paul and Harrow, Marcus, Antoinette, for your reflections already, which kind of set up what I want to talk about just on the implementation and compliance committees. And Paul, you referenced this by saying that this can be left to the committee to do its work to take things a bit further forward. Again, exactly. Left to exactly, right? So my
We have to let it work.
exactly. We have to hope that it works, and we have to empower it to work and do all of that. But one of the things that I found extremely interesting, and this has been the work that I've been doing over the last couple of years, is that the Paris Agreement Implementation and Compliance Committee has started to do work that can be described as being legal or of a legal character. If you look particularly at the way in which the Implementation and Compliance Committee looks at whether NDCs are maintained and what it means for an NDC to be maintained and what it means for an NDC to be a successive NDC, that's in some ways interpretive work that the Implementation and Compliance Committee is doing and giving rise to more meaning for the obligations, the reporting obligations that exist under the Paris Agreement itself. And one of the things that I wonder is whether, when we say that we want to let it work, we can do things as a community of lawyers or as a community of practice engaged within this field to give it more of the facilitative character with which it's empowered, but also enable it to do some more of this interpretive work in a lot of ways. I think in other test cases, for example, whether or not there has been a submission of NDCs in this last year, which countries have missed it, which countries have not, and what kind of actions the committee has taken since in terms of consultations, etc. The other part that's interesting is, of course, that we now have another co-chair who has already served as co-chair previously, and what that means for the next phase of the committee's work as well, which you will, of course, know with the multiple roles that you've played within the negotiating process. And I think the other bit that I wanted to just touch on is what all of this has meant in light of other developments within public international law. The Paris Agreement came as an agreement under the UNFCCC process. And now we have negotiations that have taken place under the Biodiversity Convention to lead us to a target and monitoring system through the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. But under the Desertification Convention, we have negotiations taking place for a drought protocol, which is using a lot of the architecture and the kind of systems thinking that took place under Paris already as a almost templatized version. Are there reflections that you have on using the Paris Agreement as a template for other international negotiations, also considering what Haru mentioned about fossil fuels, but in other spaces that have similar problems that we're trying to get global solutions for? I think that's what I'll leave it in. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you. So, Paul, no pressure. We just had one or two small thoughts. But no, seriously, as a conversation, I think we've given you a little bit that you can pick and choose to elucidate. And then we're going to turn back to, of course, the others in this conversation, which is those who have joined us, and take a round of questions.
Sure. I mean, thanks very much. And I'm very conscious that my initial intervention was, I was addressing some points. I was trying to bring in a number of points, but I certainly left many open-ended data points. So if you want me to do a whole structured debate, give me 6 hours and a couple of months to prepare.
A text on the back with some square brackets.
I'll do that. But no, I mean, there's a lot in there. So I'll try and pick up on a few things that were said. I think first, where does the Paris Agreement fit into the wider question of implementation? And I think picking up on Haro's point and also Marcus's question or comment about the link to many other processes, including trade. The Paris Agreement, the COP, the CMA, strictly speaking, when we're talking about the Paris Agreement, is not going to take decisions that decide everything that happens. It's there to oversee progress, the procedural implementation, when we need to update the rules, when we need to deal with those things. The things which are actually going to make a difference in the real world are not going to be a decision. It would be great if we lived in a world where we could take a decision, we end the use of fossil fuels in 2035. From a climate point of view, it would be brilliant. We don't live in that world. If we had a global dictator who was really powerful and could take such decisions, it might work. Such dictators tend not to be benevolent. They tend to have a few drawbacks, and in the end, they're probably not going to work on climate change. So we're not in that world. So we need, there are signals. Right? The signals matter that come out of this. but how do they interact and how do they echo and dialogue between different processes? And I'm very conscious that the COP has now become one of the biggest multilateral processes we have. The climate COP is way bigger than many of the other conventions, COPs. We're getting the numbers of heads of state and government coming to some meetings that are comparable to the opening of the General Assembly. We had 150 in Paris. Similar numbers came to Dubai. Many come to others. So there's a diplomatic focus on these. But the question is, how do they really then feed in to this dialogue between different processes? I don't think we've got that going well yet. And I think Marcus is right to highlight the trade side. I mean, the WTO has many challenges at the moment. Does it still have any role? Might be a good one if nobody respects its, takes any notice of the idea of a rules-based system. It does have a slight problem in implementation and the last few years. But how do we interact between these processes? How do we dialogue? We don't have a good system yet. The fact that we finally started to have some dialogues on trade and climate under the COP system, I think is a good thing. Many countries have resisted that for many years, but I think we need to have those conversations, and we need to find ways of structuring them so then feedback both to the climate side but also to the other side. So that's something we need to work on more, and I think it's an important point, and that really picks up on the whole issue of what can the COP deliver. It cannot decide everything, so we have to use it to do what we can do well, which is overseeing the delivery process. And I think we also need to make that more meaningful. If we take the reporting transparency system, have countries have sent in their BTRs, their biannual transparency reports? Yes, no, yes, no. It's not just a box ticking exercise. I think, yes, then this is where the Paris Committee, I think, has an interesting role to think how it can play. It's not, is a country in compliance with its commitment to submit a BTR before such a date? That matters. But is the information actually used in some way? How do we make use of it? How do we turn that into more of a learning process for the country concerned, but also for others? And I think that's partly a desire to use it. I suspect we're going to run into serious resource challenges in doing that as well. The Climate Convention is I looked once at the size of secretariats of different international organizations, and it's interesting, the Climate Convention is way at the top of convention secretariats. It's way ahead of biodiversity and let alone desertification, and most convention secretariats are 10 people or something like that attached to UNEP and in some place.
I forget the 2 interns.
Oh yeah, but the interns do a lot of work. But the compared to a true international UN agency, it's still tiny. It doesn't have those resources. 20% of its budget until now has been paid by the US, which is not contributing anymore and won't for the next few years. And it's nice to have a few billionaires and philanthropies pick up some of the money, but that raises long-term reliability. It also raises some serious issues about influence and who is doing this. A multilateral process belongs to the countries, the parties who are part of it. And if a billionaire philanthropist can say, well, I'm going to fund this, but I'd like you to do it in this way, that starts to create some very, very serious questions. And I don't want to get into that, but I think there's some real issues there to get into. So there are some serious resource constraints in making this work that we're going to have to work with in the coming years. And I think that's going to be a challenge in firstly transforming that system to go where we need it. When the final morning of Paris, we had a small meeting room of the presidency. It was about this size, and we'd used it the night before in a screen to put the Paris Agreement together with Fabius and Christiana Figueres and others. And the following morning, we did little briefings for the negotiating groups, and we shared out the work. I spoke to the least developed countries. I spoke to the island states in AOSIS. Colleagues spoke to, and then I spoke to the umbrella group, US, Australia, Canada, and so forth. And we brought them to our meeting room. Firstly, I had very quickly to turn over the page of the flipboard that had the structure of the Paris Agreement we'd been putting together the night before. Stupidly, I didn't tear off the piece of paper, and I don't know what happened to it, but it's a historic piece of paper written by Haldor Thorgesson of the UNFCCC Secretariat, who was overseeing that, where we actually pulled the final wording together. So I hid that. And then I had to, explain what was in the Paris Agreement to the ministers and others in front of me who'd come without giving them a copy of the text at that point, because we hadn't handed it out. And I remember saying, and I had the Australian minister sitting opposite me, and at some point I said, we've included the concept of climate justice in the preamble. I had a grimace from the Australian minister. And then as soon as we reached the end of the meeting, Sue Binyas came right to me and said, "What's the wording on climate justice?" And it's in inverted commas in the final version. That comes from that little intervention from Sue. So I mean, you asked about Sue and Budensky's piece on that. I can't give you a judgment on that. All I can say is if the meaning of an international treaty is fixed by the views of the negotiator of one party on what they agreed, that's not an international treaty. It's a unilateral interpretation of that treaty, and so of course it has to be interpreted, of course, and that's where the whole comments on the way in which the Paris Committee can help us interpret things as well. There's a whole series of ways. This is a living document. It's not fixed in time. The US was very, very worried about anything which opened the door to liability for loss and damage. I understand where they're coming from. That's why we put a phrasing in the decision that this didn't in any way create a new liability. But it didn't take away the existing potential issues in international law. And that's all that the ICJ said on that point. Of course, it then referred to the decisions we have developed over the years, in particular in terms of the importance of 1.5 and the way that has moved from a reference in Paris to something which is much, much more clear as the real target. And I think that was another important element. So this is a living document. It's going to be interpreted. So I take the point of Sue and Dan, but also we have to move away from a sense when every single thing is the minimum we can possibly do. We have to push this out because the world is changing. Those impacts are affecting people. And at some stage, those questions will be raised. And I think that's going to be a question for national courts to come with. It's not going to come from a decision at the COP, but it is going to come into how is that interpreted by national courts. That's much more in your area and your field of expertise in this room than mine.
Perfect moment to turn to them, actually. Like, you've put it right in front. And I'm going to challenge you. In human rights law, when we do large conferences and meetings, especially if we're talking about the needs of small island states or least developed countries or women or indigenous communities or others who haven't felt like they were fully heard in international lawmaking. Often the habit, the practice, the culture, the custom, whatever you want to call it, the tradition, if you will, is to start the conversation with, I know a woman whose property was taken away because there was no respect for women's property rights, and her sons died in the war and her husband died, and she was the one person maintaining the farm, and because of the law of her country, that farm was stolen from her. Yeah? And it brings it right down to that woman and her rights being violated. Yeah? You can give an example from many contexts depending on the human rights issue in front of you. But it's a way of helping people to understand what's real. Now, interestingly, what's real to you and your own perspective and interpretation. What we're starting to see as the tradition or the culture or in the climate negotiations, there's not the same doom and gloom predictions for 30 years hence. No. It's the head of the unit of the World Bank, my former PhD student, Victor Mosoti, who's standing up in front of us and saying, the river I grew up with in Kenya has died. I suppose if I was going to do that, I would say the forests that I fought to protect when I was 14 in British Columbia are burning. And people bring to the table the impact that is closest to them that 30 years ago was called scaremongering. by the climate deniers who were there with us in the UNFCCC creating the regime or resisting the creation of the regime, depending on their country's position. So as I turn to you, feel free to share a story, if you have one, of an impact that you're already seeing on the ground, along with your question, if only to remind ourselves of that urgency. Because I think one of the things that all of our commentators have said, and that Paul has been very clear about, is that we mustn't forget the urgency. We mustn't forget the importance of this work. Harrow's always looking for ways to make it stronger and better, even as he's also looking for ways to be clear about the deficiencies and the faults and the weaknesses. We're now faced with very clear opposition and headwinds of people who are quite the opposite, aren't they? They're very, very direct, but they're not looking for ways to make it stronger and better. They're looking at ways to, weaken it in order to support certain domestic economic interests that have a strong voice in the decision making in their countries. And it's not just the US, although Marcus likes to, poor man married to a Canadian, must be like that. But it's also, of course, Russia. It's also, of course, Saudi Arabia. It's also, from a very different and possibly climate justice perspective, our colleagues from Nigeria who point out that they had structural adjustment forcing them to adopt fossil fuel companies that came and imposed, and now we're telling them they have to move away from fossil fuels, and there are trust issues. So what I'd like to do is give you a context in which you can ask questions about the 30 years, especially the last 10 since Paris, but also bring your own experiences and understandings to the table.